I used to think that buying a home in a gated community was the ultimate sign of making it. I pictured quiet Saturday mornings, manicured lawns, and neighbors who waved as they walked their golden retrievers. What I didn't realize was that when you buy into a homeowners association, you aren't just buying a house. You're buying a ticket to a high-stakes psychological drama where the villain usually lives 3 doors down and has nothing but time on her hands. For me, that villain was Sandra. Sandra was the kind of person who treated the neighborhood bylaws like they were the 10 Commandments, but only when they applied to everyone else. She was a fixture on the HOA board, the self-appointed queen of curb appeal, and for some reason I still can't figure out, she decided that my driveway was her personal parking overflow. The problem started about 6 months after I moved in. I have a slightly awkward lot layout where my driveway is relatively short and tucked into a corner near the entrance of a common walking path. Sandra lived across the street, but her household had 4 cars. Her pristine white BMW, her husband's SUV, and 2 cars for their college-age kids who were home for the summer. Instead of using their own spacious garage or parking one car behind the other, Sandra decided it was much more convenient to pull her BMW right up against the edge of my property. At first, she was just on the street, which was annoying but legal. But then the creep started. A few inches onto the apron of my driveway. Then a foot. By the 3rd week, she was parking at a diagonal angle that effectively blocked me from being able to pull my car out of my garage without doing a 15-point turn that usually involved me driving over my own flower beds. I tried the nice approach first. I'm a firm believer that most problems can be solved with a polite conversation. I caught her one morning as she was getting out of her car, dressed in her expensive tennis whites, looking like she'd never had a hair out of place in her life. I explained the situation as gently as I could, telling her that the angle of her car made it nearly impossible for me to get to work on time. She didn't even look me in the eye. She just checked her watch and said that it was a public space and that, as a board member, she knew the rules better than I did. She told me I should learn to be a more neighborly person and that if I were better at driving, the space wouldn't be an issue. It was the condescension that really stung. It wasn't just about the car. It was the way she looked at me like I was a tenant in her kingdom rather than a homeowner who paid the same dues she did. The situation escalated quickly. I started getting citations in the mail for things I knew weren't true. A trash can left out notice on a day I wasn't even home. A lawn too long warning when I'd mowed it 48 hours prior. It was clear that my request for her to move her car had triggered a vendetta. Meanwhile, the parking got worse. She started leaving the BMW there for days at a time, sometimes leaving only inches between her bumper and my garage door. I called the police, but they told me that because it was a private HOA road, they couldn't tow unless the HOA requested it. And since Sandra was the head of the parking committee, that was never going to happen. I felt trapped in my own home, bullied by a woman who used her tiny bit of power like a weapon. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I had an important presentation at work, the kind that determines your bonus for the year. I walked into the garage, hit the opener, and saw the rear end of that white BMW centered perfectly in my field of vision. She wasn't just blocking the apron. She was halfway into my driveway. I went to her house and knocked. No answer. I rang the bell. Nothing. I could see her through the window, sitting at her kitchen island with a coffee mug, looking right at me before turning her head. She was doing it on purpose. She wanted to see if I'd break. I ended up having to take an expensive rideshare to work, and I spent the entire ride fuming. The helplessness was the worst part. But as I sat in the back of that car, I remembered something important. I had looked at my property survey when I bought the house. Because of the weird corner lot, my property line actually extended 3 feet into what everyone assumed was the common curb area. I spent that evening doing research. I didn't go to the HOA board. I went to the county records office. I confirmed that the strip of land Sandra was parking on was, in fact, mine. It wasn't a public easement. It was part of my deeded lot. I also looked up the state laws regarding spite fences and property demarcations. Then I went to a local steel fabricator. I didn't want a fence. I wanted something permanent. I ordered 4 heavy-duty industrial steel bollards, the kind they put in front of bank entrances to stop ramming attacks. They were thick, filled with concrete, and painted a professional neutral black. I also hired a surveyor to come out and stake the exact line with neon tape. The morning the installers arrived, Sandra was out there in seconds. She started screaming about permits and HOA regulations. The helplessness was the worst part. But as I sat in the back of that car, I remembered I didn't say a word. I just handed her a folder. In that folder was the certified survey, the county permit for structural landscaping, and a copy of the HOA's own bylaws which stated that homeowners were responsible for maintaining and securing their property boundaries against trespass. I pointed out that since she had repeatedly claimed the area was public, she surely wouldn't mind if I beautified my private land. The installers worked fast. They dug deep holes 3 feet down and set those steel posts in high-strength concrete. They were positioned exactly 2 inches inside my property line, creating a literal steel wall right where she usually pivoted her car. For 2 days, the BMW was gone. She had to park in her own driveway, and I enjoyed the most peaceful sleep I'd had in months. But Sandra wasn't done. She sent me a formal cease and desist from the HOA, claiming the posts were a safety hazard. I replied through my lawyer, stating that they were clearly marked with reflective tape and were located on private property to prevent ongoing soil erosion caused by unauthorized vehicles. I knew she was seething. I knew she was looking for a way to win. The climax happened on a rainy Friday night. I was watching a movie when I heard a sound I can only describe as a giant tin can being crushed by a hydraulic press. It was a loud, screeching, metallic groan followed by the sound of shattered glass and a sudden violent silence. I ran outside. There, in the dim glow of the streetlights, was the white BMW. Sandra had apparently tried to assert dominance by parking in her old spot. Or perhaps she was just so used to the muscle memory of swinging her car into my driveway that she forgot the world had changed. She had tried to whip the car into the space at an angle, likely thinking she could squeeze past. She hadn't. The first steel post had caught the front fender. Instead of stopping, it looked like she'd panicked and floored it, thinking she was just stuck on a curb. The post had acted like a giant can opener. It had peeled the entire passenger side of the BMW open, from the headlight to the rear wheel well. The structural pillar of the car was bent, the airbags had deployed because of the jarring lateral impact, and the expensive German engine was leaking fluids all over the pavement. The car was a total loss. Sandra was sitting in the driver's seat, dazed, surrounded by white dust from the airbags. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I just stood on my porch and called the non-emergency line to report an accident. When the police arrived, Sandra tried to claim that I had traps on my property. The officer looked at the black steel posts, then at the reflective tape, then at the fact that the car was clearly 2 feet inside my property line. He looked at Sandra and asked why she was driving on her neighbor's lawn. She didn't have an answer. She got a citation for reckless driving and a bill from the HOA for the fluid cleanup on the road. A week later, Sandra resigned from the HOA board. It turns out that when you total a luxury car while trespassing on a neighbor's property after months of documented harassment, your moral authority in the neighborhood tends to evaporate. The new board president is a soft-spoken guy who actually likes gardening and doesn't care about the color of my mulch. The steel posts are still there. I've grown some nice ivy around them, and they've become a bit of a local landmark. Neighbors walk by and give me a little nod, a silent acknowledgement of the person who finally stood up to the neighborhood bully. Looking back, I realize that people like Sandra only have the power you give them. They rely on your desire to be nice and your fear of conflict. But there is a quiet, powerful dignity in drawing a line, sometimes a literal line in the dirt, and refusing to let someone cross it. I lost a bit of money on those posts, and I lost the illusion of a perfect, conflict-free neighborhood. But every time I pull my car out of my garage with ease, I'm reminded that peace isn't just the absence of noise. It's the presence of boundaries. And sometimes those boundaries need to be made of steel.